Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to be showing you how I painted this butterfly in acrylics. So my first plan with any acrylic painting is to prime my surface. I want to put 2 or 3 coats of gesso on that canvas because I do personally like to work with something that's a little smoother. Once those layers of gesso have dried, I sand each layer, and then I'm at this point here when I can start working on my background. Now to start with here, I want a really nice blended soft look, a really beautiful transition from my lights to my darks. Now in order to do this with acrylics and traditional brushwork, if you don't have an airbrush, it's all in how you blend but also how you layer. Now as you can see here, it goes through many ugly stages. The very first process initially is just to get paint on that surface. Now the one thing I want to quickly mention here, this blending brush where you can see it's got the black bristles is actually a Daler and Rowney mop brush. Now these are designed for this kind of blending, but as you can see it's shedding so many of its bristles. It's very frustrating. It then made getting the blending here harder because I'm now having to potentially here, as you can see, end up with paintbrush marks where I'm trying to scrape them off my surface. Whereas the brown bristled blending brush I'm using here is actually a makeup brush. So these work perfectly. I don't find that these shed at all. As you can see, there are no hairs at all on this surface. So once you're happy with the blending brush, as you can see here, I am just working in small sections. So I'm going to be applying paint in a couple of square inches and blending that one bit out, and then I can work on the next section. In order to get this kind of blending, it's not going to look pretty early on. You have to get through that very first ugly stage until you can get something that looks a little like this. Now occasionally you will see that I've got water droplets on my surface, and that's because once I've applied the paint, I'm going to spray that with water, get a layer of that over the top, and that's going to mean I can blend that into my dry layer underneath. This is my preference for getting this kind of blending. This blending technique is far easier to explain and demonstrate in the real-time version. So I do have this up on Patreon now. It's 4.5 hours long. You have the reference photo and liner if you'd like to paint along. But because all of that is in real time and it's a voiceover where I'm explaining what I'm doing while I'm painting, I'm able to really explain each process thoroughly. So if getting this kind of smooth blending is something you find challenging with acrylics, then that tutorial could really be useful. So once my background was dry, I then used my transfer paper to get my outline on my surface. This is always my preference because it means it keeps that canvas nice and clean. I'm not going to have to freehand my sketch on with a pencil, then have to potentially erase it and cause issues there. Canvases are more pricier, canvas boards are cheaper, which is what I'm working on here, but still I want to make sure that I've got everything nice, neat and tidy. Once I was happy with that outline, I'm now just blocking in my general shapes. I'm not focusing on the exact colour of this butterfly at this stage. I'm more about my contrasts. I want to make sure I've got my darks in place and then I can build up my highlights gradually. So notice at the moment that this is looking a bit like a paint by number. It's only now at this stage where I start to refine my colour a little bit more and then build up my details from there. If you've seen many of my other YouTube videos, you'll know that I put a lot of focus on my base layer stage. It's not any good really jumping into your details that you can see that on the very top of the butterfly and putting those in first. We need to build up with what's closest to the wing and the darker colours first and build up from there gradually. And this is exactly what I'm starting to do here with this wing texture. Another element that the Patreon version focuses on is glazes. I talk about this again in a lot of my YouTube videos, and it's how you can focus on the exact colour at your very last layer. Regardless of any medium that is colour based, so colour pencils, pastels, acrylics, oils, any of those, we do put so much pressure on ourselves to mix the exact right colour from the very early stages. But the beautiful thing with acrylics, because each layer does dry quickly, we can then just adjust that colour with a very simple glaze and get that colour accurate to that reference photo in one layer. So try not to stress yourself out too much because it will actually slow down the entire painting process. Acrylics are such a forgiving medium, so all of that colour that we can see in the final photo doesn't have to be achieved at the very first layer. And it's when we start to finish the butterfly where I do then go back in with more of my orange and yellow glazes to tint some of those other areas that you can really see more of this colour come together. So one of my main aims for this painting was to make sure that I got the 3D shape of the wings right. Just like any other element, I want this butterfly's wings to look like they are partly, they're not completely spread open, so their wings are completely out to the side of them. They are ever so slightly positioned up. I want to make sure that I'm replicating that in my painting. In order to do that, I have to make sure I get my lighting correct. So closer to the body where the wings are joined up to that body, it's slightly darker, and then it's going to get lighter as it gets to those edges, but it might only be gradually. I want to make sure that I've captured those natural transitions from my lights to my darks. I don't want any harsh start and stop points between those sections because again, you're going to end up with more of a two-dimensional feel. Of course, this is going to vary depending on your light source. Let's say you've got a butterfly and there is a flower or a leaf over the top. That could cast a shadow and you end up with a harsher line. So it is going to be very subjective to what you're working on. There's no one set rule. But if you've got something like this where there is no harsh edges actually on the wing shape itself, minus the patterns of course, then do make sure that you've got that nice transition from your lights to your darks. That's going to really help to get the nice three-dimensional feel of the wings. And just like all of the other tutorials I've got here on YouTube, I'm working in small sections. This is always my preference. It does prevent any one part from becoming too overwhelming. Once I've got my base layer in for the body, you'll notice that I've painted some standard white paint over the top. Then I've gone and applied a yellow glaze, and this is exactly what I've mentioned previously in this video, how you don't have to focus on colour, you can just put white down and then adjust it with a glaze later on. It's more than achievable with acrylics to do a painting in black and white and then add your colour in glazes later on. You just have to focus on your values initially. This painting was only 15 centimetres by 15 centimetres, so it's quite small. If you compare it to the size of my hand, I'm able to fit in quite a lot of detail for the size that I'm working on. Now the reason for that mainly is that I'm using light pressure on my brushes, but I'm also using smaller sizes. I don't want to be using big brushes for something like this because I'm not going to be able to be as precise as I currently am here. The larger that you work, of course, we have more space to add detail, but if you do have a painting that's on the smaller size here, it's more than achievable to still get a photorealistic outcome. It's just about how much pressure you put on that brush in order to get your nice fine lines, as I'm demonstrating here with this liner brush. It's all in how we use that brush, where we hold it, how much pressure, the consistency of the paint. If you've got too much paint in that brush there, it's not going to flow off that brush as easily. You need to add a little bit of water, get a slightly thinner consistency so that it's a lot easier to glide off of the bristles. And again, all of these things that I decide at the time, I mention in these real-time tutorials on Patreon. So if they are of interest, I've got a pastel and an acrylic tier there, and also a combined tier for those of you like me who like to use a couple of these mediums. So if that is of interest, I will link my Patreon channel in the description below. So going back to the actual acrylic paints themselves, something else that they can get criticised for is that they look like they fade once the paint has dried. Well, that's not what's happened. If you're using the light fast colours, which I am in the Liquitex Basics, most of them are light fast, which is another reason why I love that brand. But it's not that they have faded, it is just that the paint has dried, and it's dried with a matte finish. By the time you put a gloss varnish over the top, the paint is going to look as it did when it was wet. So your darks are going to look nice and dark again. Those beautiful oranges in the wings here and the green of the background is going to be even more vibrant because of that varnish. Now, one thing that you can do throughout the painting process is make sure that your painting is completely dry, and then you can get a larger flat shaped brush with just a little bit of water on, and you can run that across your painting. What that will do is show you what it looks like when it's varnished. You can then make the decision that, well, actually, I do need to make my darks a little bit darker here, or I could hype up my colour saturation. But it's better to do that at the time before you varnish it, obviously, because once you have varnished, most of the time they're not removable, so you're not able to then put paint back on top. So that's one handy tip that I use throughout my painting process to always judge my contrasts. You just want to make sure, as I say, it's really important that the paint underneath is completely dry. Also, don't run that brush over any parts that just have your liner and your transfer lines in place, because of course that's just really like chalk and pastel, so that will end up being erased with that brush. So onto the flowers. There wasn't that much detail that you could see here because the butterfly's wings were cast in a strong shadow. So I really did just look at this as abstract shapes. I mapped in where my main magenta and purples are, and as you can see here, I'm now building up some of my lighter colours. The key point to this is that I'm building it up gradually. I'm not picking my brightest pinks or purples first. I'm just working in those lovely subtle layers. This part of the painting really was an element where you literally just have to focus on abstract shapes. Don't look at this as a flower at all, because you can't really distinguish individual flowers here because of the lighting and that shadow. I was confident that as long as I had a broken up area with my mid-tone pinks and purples, that the viewer's eye would automatically fill in those blank spaces. So I always talk about this in tutorials on Patreon. If you can't see details there, don't feel like you have to add them in. If you're working from a good quality photo, and this one was, and I sourced this from Pixabay, it's showing you then that if you can't see details in one area, there's going to be a reason why. And in this case, it is because of the wing and it's cast in that shadow. You're not able to get the light source that's directly hitting these flowers, which is going to then help to keep everything in focus. So this is one of those elements where, because I knew I had a good quality photo, I had to trust what I couldn't see and paint it as it is. Now, if you're working from a low quality photo, if you're doing a pet portrait, for instance, sometimes the quality there is not as good as you would ideally like, then yes, you might have to add in more details in some areas. What I would do in that situation is source other photos from Pixabay that are royalty free of a similar dog, the same colour, very similar pose, but you can use those details from the royalty free version and incorporate that into your own painting. But certainly for something like this, where I knew I had a good photo and I can't see detail, just paint what you see. Something else that you can also do is turn your painting upside down and turn your reference photo upside down, and your brain will then be far easier to judge it as shapes rather than flowers. So here, now I'm just adding my final details. I was building up my pink and fuchsia colours gradually. Once I was happy with that, it is just a matter of adding those details to the wings to make it look like it sat on top of that flower. So it's really hard during footage to get a really accurate representation of that because of the lighting and so on. It was very bright here in the UK, very hot, very sunny, so I had to have my blinds down. So this is an accurate photograph of my painting, and you can really see how beautiful those colours are. I've got really nice sharp contrast in my dark shadows, but my highlights are really standing out, and that is all in my contrast, not the colour. So if that's the biggest tip I could give anybody, it's make sure that you've got your shadows dark and your highlights bright. So I really hope this tutorial was of use. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a thumbs up, because it really does help. And if you'd like to get notified of future content, hit the subscribe and the bell button. I'm going to be uploading another video to YouTube next week, but as I've mentioned, if you're interested in my slower tutorials, my link to Patreon is in the description below. If you've got any art related questions, pop them in the comments. I'm more than happy to help if I can. And as always, thank you so much for watching.